My name's Alastair MacGibbon. Over the next several weeks, I'm speaking with high-profile Australian political, bureaucratic and business leaders as we explore Australia's cybersecurity landscape, including the recently released 2020 cybersecurity strategy. Despite a life of public service, the Secretary of the Department of Home Affairs, Mike Pezzullo, is not your regular Mandarin. Described as one of the most brilliant public servants in Canberra, he's also one of the most powerful. He lives up to the public service ethos of frank and fearless advice and is trusted, if not occasionally feared, by the political class on both sides of politics and the odd public servant or two. And I've probably been in that category myself. He was the chief architect of the 2009 Defence White Paper and a key force behind Australia's modern centralised security apparatus. Secretary Pezzullo is a keen student of military and political history and strategy. His views are deeply informed by historical context, particularly the period from the French Revolution to the end of the Cold War. He's been a senior staffer in Parliament House in both government and opposition, as well as a public servant in the Departments of Defence, Immigration and Customs, and Prime Minister and Cabinet. For today's discussion, his views are particularly relevant. He runs Australia's most powerful domestic policy department and is in charge of shaping and delivering the government's cybersecurity policy, including the 2020 strategy and associated critical infrastructure reforms. Mike Pezzullo, good afternoon.
Hi Alastair, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Mike. And if our mics were hot before we started today, and I apologise to the broader audience, but we just had some good banter there beforehand.
Very friendly banter.
So there weren't any threats made, which is good. We should recognise that today is September 11. Where were you on that evening in 2001?
Well, it was the evening here in Australia. I was actually at home here in the ACT in Canberra. I was working at the time on the ministerial staff of the then Leader of the Opposition, Mr Kim Beazley. I was the Deputy Chief of Staff who ran the policy shop in the Leader's office and specifically had the lead policy role on national security.
Right, so how did the events of September 11 change the security landscape and the way policy got made in Australia?
Well, self-evidently, it was a global event. It was a spectacular event. It was a spectacular attack in the sense that it was designed to create both terror and the spectacle around terror, hence that use of the term spectacular on the part of Al-Qaeda. For those of us who had been concerned about the terrorist risk, of course, Al-Qaeda was a somewhat known quantity, and Mr Howard, I have to say, was meticulous as Prime Minister in ensuring that the Leader of the Opposition was regularly briefed, and I well recall at the time the security agency heads regularly coming to see Kim as the Leader of the Opposition, and of course, in accordance with their statutory obligations, were keeping him informed. And I do recall on the day, both the heads of O&A, as it then was, the heads of ASIO and others came to brief Mr Beazley. It was apparent within moments, if not the first few hours, that the Americans would undertake a massive response. It was really just about what the target was, and they were clearly not going to allow an attack of that extraordinary impact to go unpunished. And as we know, they embarked on very significant military, special forces and intelligence operations shortly thereafter. I think for a number of years subsequently, and you saw follow-up attacks, not necessarily directly by Al-Qaeda, but by affiliates, principally in Europe, but of course Australia had its share of tragedy, both in Bali, our embassy in Jakarta and elsewhere. It very much conflated, and I don't say that in any negative or disparaging way, because you've got to deal with the priorities that you face, but it really pushed the terror agenda or the counter-terror agenda out to the span of security. And what it did in a positive sense, it focused the mind, and regrettably, after a tragic event like that, you'd like to think that everything was done possibly to thwart such an event, but having occurred, it really focused us on what we needed to do in relation to terror. That's on the upside, and we certainly improved our procedures, our practices, our resilience, our counter-terror capability. What it did, though, it crowded out that agenda, and then subsequently, and perhaps we'll come to this shortly, when in the Defence Department we were starting to think about the geostrategic circumstances as we evaluated the preparations in preparing for the 2009 White Paper. There were other geopolitical and geostrategic tendencies or trends that were on foot that had somewhat become pushed to the margin. So it had a galvanising effect, but it also crowded out the security discussion.
So let's flick to the 2009 strategy. You were sort of the chief pen holder on that. I'll focus on the cyber bit. How was cyber seen in the 2009 Defence White Paper?
Well, to answer that question, I really need to pick up where I just left the previous answer. We made a concerted effort. It had started under in the last period of the Howard government with Dr. Nelson as the Defence Minister, starting to think about the prospects of major power conflict. We were looking at some of the military modernisation that was going on, principally in what is today termed the Indo-Pacific. In those days, we tended to refer more to the Asia-Pacific. Some of the modernisation of major military capability, particularly of a maritime character, but also space and cyber. I'll quickly come back to that thread in a moment. And so the 2009 White Paper, obviously since has receded into strategic history because there have been subsequent White Papers, but essentially the force structure that the Rudd government landed on in the 2009 White Paper is largely the DNA, with very significant adjustments made by the coalition government subsequently under two White Papers and a defence update since. But the switch to a maritime major power force, major power informed force, really was set in the 2009 White Paper. In that context, cyber was seen for the first time, notwithstanding something of a reference in the 2000 White Paper 9 years earlier. Cyber really came to the fore as a strand of conflict. Cyber warfare, for the first time in our doctrine, for the first time in our strategy, was given White Paper status. And certainly in the Defence Department, we saw it as an extension of major power conflict.
Is that the first time you'd actually thought about cyber security? That sounds bad. Is that the first time, you mentioned it was the first time it was mentioned as a type of warfare, etc. Is that the first time in the Department of Defence that it became as elevated as that?
Not quite. There had been some progress made over from the late 90s. There was a reference in the 2000 White Paper, and then of course after 9/11, with that conflation of terror and the conflation of the security and terror agenda, and I don't say conflation again in any disparaging sense, it's just a fact that governments and the policy spectrum has only so much bandwidth. Cyber was certainly looked at through the 2000s, through that prism. I think what started to occur from the mid-2000s, 05, 06, 07, was for the first time in a generation, we started to give serious thought to major power conflict and Australia and its maritime environs being potentially caught up in a major power conflict, and then thinking through what would that mean for space, what would that mean for cyber, what would that mean for undersea warfare. So it became, in my own professional thinking, because I really hadn't had roles prior to that required any deep investment or any deep focus in the area, because I was Deputy Secretary for Defence Strategy, obviously, my principal focus through that latter part of the 2000s, from 05, 06 and onwards, was really in the realm of cyber warfare. And then obviously there have been subsequent both white papers but also cybersecurity strategies, which we'll no doubt get to, that have really amplified our sense of cyber well beyond the remit of cyber warfare.
It's interesting you talked about the reference in 2000. There were 32 references to cyber in the 2009 paper and 55 references in 2016. I guess I wonder where it will go to in the next one. I'm presuming a lot more.
Well, without spending too much time on the military side of it, because of course in the Department of Home Affairs we focus on the non-military side, but on the military side it's now become an intrinsic and entrenched part of the domain of warfare. So the spectrum of warfare, you know, initially land and then sea, and then in the early 20th century air, and then of course space, and really cyber has become another domain.
You've got Marcus Thompson there, and a two-star general, and
and in fact, in terms of defence strategy and military affairs, it doesn't make sense to actually treat it as a discrete domain. It's one of the vectors and one of the enablers your warfighting capability. You need to think about what the adversary will do to you potentially, and what you need to do potentially back to them in anticipation or in retaliation.
Yeah. Hey, a slight tangential move. You were a staffer, as we said in the introduction, and you've mentioned in the answer to the first question, both in government and opposition. As a public servant, did your time up in Parliament House help you?
Yes.
In what ways?
Well, I think certainly the time that I spent in Parliament House, which straddled the period of the Keating government and the period when Mr Beazley led the opposition, so 3 years with the Foreign Minister in the latter Keating period and then a number of years with Mr Beazley as the leader of the opposition, we're probably at the very tail end of a generational shift where principally, and in most offices, the majority of staffers were actually public servants. And it's what I've described in other fora and in speeches about public administration. It was the last of what I would describe as the British private secretary model, where what is shorthandedly now called the staffer wasn't really there as a creature of the party. Certainly, there were very few instances that I could recall, certainly in the federal sphere, of staff occupying positions whilst they, in some cases, awaited pre-selection opportunities, and very few of us, in fact, many of us weren't even involved in party affairs, and very few, if any, were there in terms of pre-selection, and very few also focused on what I would describe as the electoral dimension of the life of a minister's role. A minister clearly is a creature of electoral politics. That's the whole point. There's no point being in opposition or being out of government if you want to be a minister who can make a difference through the executive. But the focus in ministerial offices, and I don't say this in any way to express a view that it's detrimental, it's just simply an empirical observation because it's changed. The offices were very much about policy, speeches and communication. Right. Party politics and electoral politics was really put to one side. And most ministers, in fact, did not have political advisors in the way that we would think of them today. To answer your question, why is that an enriching experience? You get to understand, and it still happens today, it's just the balance has slightly shifted. You get to understand the pressures on a minister, you get to understand their roles and responsibilities, how in a representative democracy with responsible government, the minister is the decision maker, except insofar as the law provides otherwise, for the entire policy realm of the department. And the sense that you sometimes get, particularly for those public servants who have not worked in a ministerial context, the minister or his office or her office wants to do this, but we don't necessarily agree. But of course, we'll do what we're told. That simplistic view, and relationships are much more nuanced than that. But that simplistic view of the relationship between a department and a minister's office is actually fundamentally anti-democratic. It doesn't respect the fact that it's the minister whose name is on the ballot paper. It's the minister who faces that very direct accountability through their presence in the parliament. The whole genius of the British representative system is that the executive is in the parliament and subordinated to the parliament insofar as they're accountable to the parliament. Yes, as a political scientist or an external observer, you can get that sense by reading about it. You get that sense by mixing in those circles, but it's really only when you're really in the front line.
Viscerally part of it.
That it just becomes so instinctive. It just becomes part of your DNA. And look, personally, I've expressed this view before to the Institute of Public Administration and elsewhere. I think it would benefit the country if we just turn the dial, not completely back to, but slightly back to those days when there was a freer interchange of public servants going into ministerial offices and vice versa without going through the filter of what I would describe as electoral politics. There is a role for electoral politics. I'm not suggesting that otherwise. It's part of our liberty to have groups come together to form political associations, to form political parties, to advance an ideological agenda that's based on policy values. That's actually a good part of our democracy. My contention is having more public servants who are in ministerial offices able to assist the minister with policy development and the communication of good policy, I think is beneficial to both government, but also beneficial to the public service.
I promise you this. We'll get on to cybersecurity now. So let's talk about how the cybersecurity policy sausage is made in Canberra. From a high level, could you describe to those watching today how the 2020 cybersecurity strategy was built?
Well, when Mr Turnbull announced the formation of the Department of Home Affairs, he consciously put the cybersecurity policy function into Home Affairs. I remember he and I speaking at the time about getting these balances right, but with a cognizance of the fact that there was a skills agenda, an industry agenda, an employment agenda. There was the interface with defence that we spoke about earlier, given their focus on cyber warfare. The CERT function was brought across into the Australian Signals Directorate with the creation of the Australian Cyber Security Centre under your leadership, Alastair. So whichever way you federated these responsibilities, there always has to be, I'll use the present tense, a centre of gravity around policy and strategy, and in those links into skills, into the university sector, into industry policy, and so on and so forth. There's a crossover into online safety and e-safety, which is a function of the communications portfolio. And then, of course, there's the operational centre of gravity, whichever way you cut it, has to have an intrinsic link to the signals authority. There's no way you can do modern cyber without some kind of connection in the Australian context between your cybersecurity operations function, the Australian Cyber Security Centre principally, and the Australian Signals Directorate. So whichever way you cut these functions, you have to consciously place the pieces before you get to structures in that functional alignment. So with that lead responsibility that was assigned to us in December of 2017, we started very early thinking about, as early as 2018-19, how is the 2016 strategy going? What are the things that we could build on? What are the things that perhaps need further refreshing? Cyber, as you well know, and your company well knows, is evolving at breakneck speed. There are developments that aren't measured in terms of years, they're measured in terms of months and weeks. Yep. You've got to stay across all of that. And so we were very conscious that, quite apart from the formal mandate of a refresh of the 2016 strategy 4 years hence, of course 2020, we started work very early in the piece. We stood up a cyber security policy division, very deliberately co-located that team with the Australian Cyber Security Centre here in the ACT, over in their premises over at Brindabella Park. And very early on, we started to map out what are the things that form points of continuity, where we want to keep building on the very comprehensive 2016 strategy. What are the things that we want to mark off to evolve our thinking in terms of potential changes of direction? The most critical of which struck me very early in the piece, as early as 2018. I've given Senate and other testimony to this effect, because some of this, of course, became the subject of public discussion, but being much more being directive in relation to systems of national significance and the importance of protecting critical infrastructure. And of course, that's since come to pass with the bringing down of the 2020 strategy, and perhaps we'll get to speak about in a moment the security of critical infrastructure initiative. We also thought some of the cybercrime work needed to evolve, particularly with the advent of the dark web. It was already around, of course, but some of the tools that you need to penetrate into the dark web didn't have the policy or legislative foundation that we felt was appropriate. In other areas, it was more about continuity. It was about building on the establishment of the Australian Cyber Security Centre, building on the joint cybersecurity centres in the capital cities, building on the skills agenda, building on the industry agenda. So it was a mixture of things to build on, and in some cases, points of departure. We started the work in serious earnest in 2018, and it's been a solid two and some year journey. And of course, that culminated in the bringing down of the strategy a couple of months ago now.
So just you've hugely encyclopedic knowledge and memory of these things, which always embarrasses me that you remember more than I do about even areas that I ran. So I should call you more often. But joint cybersecurity centres, where do you see them going? And just briefly explain them to those who are watching today.
Well, a wonderful initiative of the 2016 strategy, and essentially initially set up, and I really want to applaud your leadership, just in case you've forgotten.
That's very
Alastair.
kind of you. I appreciate it. We'll highlight that one, do a highlight reel.
In establish them, and your insights in this are actually more valuable than mine. Initially set up with an industry-facing or sectoral focus, which we want to maintain. What the 2020 strategy has done is overlaying that is also to act as regional hubs for state, territory and local government. So the centre in Brisbane will continue to have a particular functionality, the one in Sydney and Melbourne and so on and so forth. But they'll also be a hub and a centre of gravity for the state government, for the local governments, in the case of Brisbane, say, for Queensland-based industry. So they'll have both a nationwide sectoral area of focus, which was established under your leadership, but also having that state focus as well. They are, of course, that program is run by the Australian Signals Directorate through the Australian Cybersecurity Centre. We've got some additional funding.
I was going to say the money. There's real money behind that,
and there's real money. They've really established themselves. Yep. They're all a bit different when you tour around, and I think that was a function of the different industry-facing missions that they were
almost
given.
Anarchic governance too, right? It was very local, and I can say that, you probably can't, but it was bottom up.
It was somewhat bottom up, and I know Rachel Noble, the Director General, and Abby Bradshaw, the head of the Cybersecurity Centre, now wants to build on that organic growth, that somewhat organic growth in each of them, and to overlay them with a nationally consistent governance framework, which is both, as I said earlier, sectorally facing, whether it's energy or banking or telcos, but also able to link to state government, which state governments, as you know, are becoming increasingly focused on and concerned. Large local government areas similarly are concerned about cyber, as they should be. So each of the heads of centre will have both the functional responsibility and a targeted state or territory responsibility.
Okay. A difference that I can see in the 2016 strategy to the 2020 strategy is the concept of training of people more broadly and industry funding of a cyber industry. So that was more prominent in 2016 than 2020. Why that difference?
The government considered that, and the government's view was we need to maintain continuity. We're happy to build on that, but the new directions that we want to strike out in are really, I wouldn't call them gaps, but they were areas that were less developed in 2016. So, for instance, the heavy emphasis that you see in the 2020 strategy on the protection of critical infrastructure is really a function of a recognition that you ultimately are going to have market failure in those areas of the cybersecurity spectrum where really it's going to be government capability, government knowledge of the threat, government awareness of the signatures, which in some cases can only be detected by certain systems. They might be experienced or noticed by private sector sensors and private sector capability, but it's really the signals capability that I mentioned earlier that will give you that deep, rich insight. So it's really about saying, and I would urge all those interested viewers to think of 2016 and 2020 cybersecurity strategies as being a couplet. You add them together, and the whole that they create. So, for instance, the joint centres in the capital cities that I mentioned earlier continue to exist from 2016. They've been added to. So you should really read the two strategies together rather than thinking that one has supplanted the other.
Yeah, and I often think about that investment bit in industry, that there's just much more. Well, we're a private equity backed company. There's venture capital now. None of that was around in 2016.
Yes.
So in 4 years, you were mentioning how things are measured now in weeks and months, whereas in the past we think decades strategically. I'm suspecting, and it's a statement more than a question, that a lot of that's just because there's just different amount of money flowing in and a more mature industry.
I think it's certainly more mature, and it's evolved certainly in leaps and bounds just in 4 years, let alone who's to say what the landscape's going to look like in 10 years' time. But I will say this, and the settings allow for this, or in fact are designed to allow for this. As the security obligations flow through, should the Parliament see fit to positively consider the government's proposed legislation, which is currently in the consultative and co-design phase, and you'll see legislation, as the Prime Minister and Mr Dutton and Minister Reynolds announced some weeks ago now, that relates to those security obligations, I think that will be a market forming and market shaping event.
Right. Yeah. So it's
governments through their legislative action, through regulation, create markets. Because whether it's an explicit positive security obligation, the PSOs that were announced in the cybersecurity strategy, whether it's the standards that might emerge in relation to the Internet of Things and devices, whether it's further developments that have been foreshadowed in relation to the protection of consumer data. And one of the announcements, of course, was that the Treasury, ourselves in Home Affairs and the Department of Industry, Science and Energy, we're going to look at the standards both for devices but also for data.
Mm-hmm.
As obligations are either hardwired into our economy or standards are set such that the market itself forms around those obligations, whether it's the financial sector, whether it's the hospital sector, whether it's the telecommunications sector, space will be created for increasingly both a combination of national sovereign capability and in some cases authorised capability. So it'll be the case, and you've seen this discussion in the associated area of 5G, where government regulation starts to set the parameters of risk, who may or may not conform with the definition of being an appropriate vendor. And I think cybersecurity is one of those areas that we should be seriously looking at in terms of sovereign capability, particularly as we think about the recovery and reconstruction coming out of COVID.
Yeah.
Where are the jobs going to come from? Where are the new industries? And without drawing too sentimental a link to it, and it's very different historical circumstances, but if we get this right, it's almost as big an opportunity that's presenting, and our hearts go out to those who have suffered through COVID, and continue to suffer, and no one ever wants to think that suffering is itself a good thing. But the disruption could, we could slump our shoulders, be very pessimistic about the future, or we could think, as previous generations have, say, off the back of the Great Depression and the Second World War.
What's the opportunity? What
is the new Australia that we want to have rise up out of these, I won't say ashes, but we're in a very deep recession. Some of the world will be even more impacted. We're yet to see the geopolitical, geostrategic and geoeconomic consequences of COVID work their way through the system. We can position ourselves, Alastair, as providers of goods and services of choice. And it seems to me in the area of sovereign data, cybersecurity, a highly skilled workforce, massive innovation. Aussies are great lateral thinkers and problem solvers. Our ability to bring together engineers, computer scientists, data scientists is right up there. And we, I think, should be quite ambitious in this area.
So I've got about 30 questions that come from all of that.
Sure.
And I'm going to throw my notes out, so let me just put them down. Let me give you a few of the questions, and,
sure.
and you can
sure.
weave your answers in. One, you chose not to regulate the cybersecurity industry. I'd like to know why, and I respectfully why. Whereas an electrician or a plumber, when they come into your house, you know at least left and right of arc what they're going to do. Should we look at cybersecurity industry being better regulated? And then before you answer, because it might last a while, I'm going to ask you, and you mentioned, just don't send the van around, is you talked about a comparative Australian advantage. How do we compete against someone like Israel and the US, who are powerhouses of cybersecurity? What are the unique advantages? We don't have the same existential threat that Israel's got. Thank goodness for that, right? Remarkable country and really good cybersecurity products. How do we compete against them? So those two questions first.
Well, look, we did turn our mind to this question. I don't think at the moment, well, the judgment is not about what I think. The judgment was made that we're not quite at the point yet, although I said earlier we're looking at standards around both products and services. I think inevitably the work that I referred to before that we, Treasury and the Department of Industry are doing, I think when you get to one of the great service offerings of the future, which will be around data, which will be around cybersecurity, not quite the same as the electrician or the plumber, which obviously regulated through state bodies, something that looks like a regulatory scheme will by definition have to emerge, because whether it's a function of consumer protection, whether it's a function of consumer choice, or whether, quite properly, small, medium enterprises, larger enterprises, and ultimately at the very top of the commercial food chain, those large enterprises that run that critical infrastructure or assets and networks within critical infrastructure that I mentioned earlier, are going to want to have confidence that the entity that they're engaging with is accredited, is properly
fit for purpose.
Fit for purpose. Now, how exactly we get the regulatory, how we land is the work of the next 12 to 18 months with the regulatory task force that has been co-led by Secretaries Fredericks and Kennedy and myself. We have started to engage on that question. Obviously, we want to engage closely with Rachel Noble, Director General Noble at the ASD, about what role they might play, because in any industry, whether it's plumbing, the electricians, which you mentioned, in any industry where there is a regulatory standard set, it's got to be fit for purpose, it can't be burdensome, it's got to be consistent with the government's larger imperatives around deregulation. But equally, whether it's the family, selecting their Wi-Fi, whether it's the device you give to your kid, your children, whether it's an SME conforming with data protection obligations, whether it's a bench of accredited services. Well, we don't do that for plumbing or electricity, but we do ensure that people are accredited. The exact model is still a work in progress.
So, sorry, I interrupted.
No, I was just going to say, I think market forces and regulatory forces inevitably get us to a model. What I'm hedging on, and not doing it, I'm trying to be as open as I can, is the exact design of such a scheme.
Right. Paragraph 36, and everyone knows I love paragraph 36 of the cybersecurity strategy, for those of you following along at home. It talks about, from memory, references to consumer law, privacy law. It makes an oblique reference in the second dot point to directors and officers sort of obligations. Is that the type of stuff that you're looking at in that task force? In the
broad. So your question was about the regulation of the sector. What I'm saying is that'll be part of a larger review of consumer law in Australia. Goes back to the 70s. It has been modernised over time. Is it really fit for purpose in relation to cyber and the protection that consumers would expect?
So that could be products as much as services
right? It could be products. So the reason why David Fredericks has joined us on that, and you're right, you accurately quoted the paragraph. We carefully...
My favourite one.
We carefully scripted it. We thought both services and products. Mr. Dutton has since released for discussion a voluntary code of conduct and practice around the Internet of Things. So that goes to devices that obviously connect into the internet in the same way, and it took some years, of course, but in the same way, and it's not a precise analogy, but in the same way that cars today are very different from the cars that were around when you and I were growing up, when you and I both had hair. Whether it's seatbelts.
I think you're looking very handsome, though.
Whether it's seatbelts, airbags, braking. There's been tremendous evolution in safety.
And a lot of that was driven by, in fact, a lot of people are buying cars still based on the safety rating.
Absolutely. So, and whether this is for a future white paper, a cybersecurity white paper or similar, or otherwise, certainly the work of the regulatory task force that you've drawn attention to, which has got a 12 to 18 month remit, will, I think, sketch out most of the ground. Now, whether every single law, whether every single regulatory scheme, every single product standard will be nailed, in fact, I can say I doubt very much that'll be done, but I think the roadmap for the decades ahead will be landed by this task force, which is on a comeback path to our government.
Right.
And I just want to emphasise yet again, it's not just Home Affairs, cybersecurity, but the industry department that's got policy responsibility for standards, and the Treasury, because of the responsibilities they have for consumer law and competition policy. The three of us are working as co-equal leads of this effort.
So the states are also doing some stuff on standards at the moment. How do we, and it comes down to the question of sort of our federalist system, and I'm heading into dangerous ground here given your encyclopedic knowledge of political systems. But how is our way our governments are structured and the way they operate fit for purpose in the cyber world, in the sense of that regulatory type approach and our response to a cyber matter?
Well, I think Alastair, we have to flip it the other way, which is how do we help the Federation to be fit for purpose? Because we can't wave it away.
No.
And as someone who's leading the non-health response within the Australian government on COVID, I wake up every morning deeply appreciative of the wonderful Federation that we have, and which I embrace. And just like Cepheus, it's you roll that boulder up that slope, and then the next night it comes back down. You roll it back up. So, and if you need to deal with the existential angst that creates, just read your Camus and look. It is.
We'll put a link in the bottom of.
Please put a link. All the humanities scholars who are on this broadcast will immediately understand the myth of Cepheus and the work done by Camus about dealing with the existential angst of rolling that boulder. The Federation is a many splendid thing. We have to make it work. I mentioned earlier, for this purpose, consumer law. We have, and it's taken some decades to refine it. The push in the late 60s, early 70s through law reform to improve consumer rights, to encode those rights in statute, to give consumers a voice and a protection, had to be mapped across the Federation. So you've got Australian federal law, and you also have fair trading. You have safety.
Of course, yeah.
So
we ACCC on the one hand, and then
correct.
State and territory.
And similarly, in the area of workplace relations, we have a federal law, but we also have we have federal and state laws around industrial safety, around workplace relations. We've cracked this code before. And if the starting point is, you've got this Federation, and wouldn't it be terrific if we just had a unitary? Well, that's a different Australia. We don't have a unitary system, so we have to make it work. And the challenge, and again, getting back to the task force over the next 12 to 18 months, will actually be to think about, for both goods, devices, services, data, how do you have a federalist approach to modernising laws, modernising regulatory schemes, and modernising the protections that consumers and citizens rightly expect.
And obligations on service providers, but what about the directors and officers and the like?
So the reference that is in the cybersecurity strategy, which is there plainly for all to see, I mentioned earlier that spectrum. From the very top-down perspective, there'll be obligations that'll be quite prescriptive and specific on operators of systems of national significance. We haven't yet defined that class. We're in a consultative phase, but the self-evident ones that suggest themselves would be elements of the financial system, energy. Nothing much happens without power. Water systems, key national infrastructure that relates to it's almost existentially connected to our life as an economy and living in a society. The next level down will be not quite as prescriptive, but as set out in the cybersecurity strategy, what are the obligations that listed company executives and officers and directors are properly required to observe, in the same way that listed companies have to do all sorts of things.
I use work health and safety as one of my examples there, or not?
Well, indeed. And again, I touched on earlier how you strike the balance between prescription and deregulation and getting the regulatory touch right. That's also part of the work that I've just been referring to. Again, very important to have Treasury there. And then, of course, there's the unincorporated sector where so many Australians are employed. SMEs, no directors' duties there, no obligations that attach themselves to being a listed company. What are the obligations there? And it might well be, and this is just to speculate, and nothing here should be seen as being definitive, it might be in the SME space, and we had this discussion within government as the policy was being developed. It might be there that objectives are set around the protection of data, the rights that your customers have for their data to be protected, and it might be that there's a somewhat more organic rather than top-down prescribed scheme of design there, whereby it's really what objectives are you meant to achieve in terms of locking down whether you're the florist, the hairdresser, the plumber, the chemist, and that'd be quite different from the obligations that, for instance, you might put on a telco
Right.
or an electricity generator.
Because the consequence of failure is significantly different. I interviewed Andy Penn last week. In his in that industry sort of consultative advisory report that came out before the strategy, and in the strategy, it talks about government being an exemplar for cybersecurity. For those watching who don't know, you often talk about cricket analogies. I'm a T20 fan, as you know, and you're more of a Test cricket fan, and we can have that debate. I just like the action of the T20. Sometimes you refer to us, whether we're Sheffield Shielders or Test cricketers. Where's government when it comes to its cybersecurity?
There are certainly
that was a long question, but I had to get the cricket reference.
There are certainly some Test players. There are certainly people in government systems who can compete, but quite candidly, and the Auditor General has come to this view. The Australian Cybersecurity Centre has published advisories in this respect, partly as a function of legacy systems, and in some cases, systems that have to be rendered interoperable. You do get gap seams and fractures in your cyber protections just as a function of 2 decades, 3 decades of evolved investment, shall we say. We are actively looking at this in the context of the cybersecurity strategy. The government's mandated that this isn't the silver bullet that will solve all problems, but we're looking to consolidate at least the attack surface to better defend it with tighter, fewer hubs, so that the larger players who have got the depth, who've got the skills, they've got the resources, in some cases they've got the connectivity to the Australian Signals Directorate in real time that can provide us with that threat picture that I mentioned earlier, that is unique to the Signals Authority, but also in some cases large departments have got more capacity. How we can form protected environments that aggregate, that at least provide a harder external shell. It doesn't, of course, obviate the other work you've got to do to get protection right down to the endpoint, right down to the device, right down also to the human practices, which, as you well know, as you and your company well know, are just as frankly as important as some of the technical solutions. In fact, probably just in some cases more important than some of those human behaviours. So going for scale, consolidating. The Secretary's Board has formed itself around this issue. My colleague Catherine Campbell, who's got the portfolio for digital services, will lead a government a Secretary's Board digital group, which I'm on it, and we're going to work through how do we get to scale, how do we consolidate, and where there are known vulnerabilities, because in some cases you've got some systems that are quite old, the coding's old, the vulnerabilities are known, but it's not a simple matter because of...
you've got to migrate the app. And
you've got to migrate, and in some cases, taking systems down and offline to do even fairly perfunctory patches create risk. And so how do you put defences, how do you put sensors, how do you, with a known vulnerability, put mitigating alternative measures in place until over time, new investment comes through to allow you to decommission and to build in a world of virtualized systems, and in a world where cybersecurity, frankly, is much more built into the design of modern systems. While you're waiting for that investment to flow through and you can decommission some of those older systems, how can you at least create a lager or a perimeter around those systems that at least block out more of the threat? So we're very actively engaged on that. I think the operating model for federal government cyber will need to change, because to do all the things I've just suggested, you can't just put that in a box called cyber and then have your network operations and your architecture and your deployment of apps and your upgrades off over here. So how CIOs work with CISOs and how all of that works in a more aggregated fashion is something that we're working through. But Secretary Gaetjens, the head of the Public Service and the chair of the Secretary's Board, has given us a fairly tight time frame to work through those issues.
What is that time frame, mate?
By the end of this financial year, we will have a single cyber security hub strategy. We'll have mapped out all the known vulnerabilities and where we have to place local defences and local sensors to protect right down to endpoint known vulnerabilities we will, and how we harden that external shell. I won't because we haven't settled on a number, but the number of hubs, cybersecurity hubs, the number of perimeters will be dramatically reduced, not just as a function of the work that you'd be familiar with from years past to consolidate the gateways,
consolidation, right? Yep.
But this will also be about consolidating the cybersecurity defences.
So that's an important point. So this is different to a gateway consolidation strategy, which
it builds on it.
Yep.
Gateway consolidation is a necessary but not sufficient element of a cybersecurity hub strategy.
Got it. So it's much more complex than gateways, but you'll collapse down the number of gateways as a consequence.
As a consequence.
Yep. So and
consolidate your firepower, both your defensive firepower, and subject, of course, to the legislation that we mentioned, that I mentioned earlier. Certain assets and networks within government will be designated as critical infrastructure.
Yep.
So they'll also be able to be actively defended by ASD.
That's interesting because I didn't see government, and maybe I didn't read it properly, that on the list didn't see government on the list of critical infrastructure on that.
It will be
in that critical infrastructure paper. Okay, it makes sense, right?
It will be.
So let's go to ASD. I was just about to pivot, and you mentioned them. You'd put them as test cricketers in that same analogy?
Super test players. So if we go back to that golden era where there were
you're going to test my cricket history.
Where there were three teams competing, thanks to Mr. Packer, the Aussies, the West Indies, and the rest of the world. The golden days for those of us who were teenagers in the 70s to have in the one country Barry Richards, Viv Richards, Dennis Lilly, Mike Proctor, all playing super tests. I think one of my life's passions, which I'll do in retirement, I'm going to join the advocacy group that says that those statistics and records from that 2-year golden period should be added to the records. Absolutely.
Right. Well, it's something to do in retirement, which you're not going to be doing soon, I'm sure.
The wickets taken by Dennis Keith Lilly in those 2 years.
Now I'm treading into dangerous territory, but you keep going. Huh?
Against people like Viv Richards and Barry Richards, Graham Pollock should absolutely be counted. And I seriously don't think that Dennis Lilly is observing these proceedings, but a shout out to my boyhood idol, Dennis Lilly.
Fantastic.
Dennis Keith Lilly.
So now I'm off topic, weirdly, which is rare for me. It's not happened ever before. And I know you've never strayed into cricket analogies before, Mike. There was significant money, and I say significant, it's not significant in defence terms.
Sorry,
right?
the point there was that ASD operated
they're good, is what you're saying.
So if you're developing a super test league,
now you're going back into your fantasy league.
ASD would be super test cricketers.
Would be on your fantasy list. Yeah. Now we're going to throw to we have some questions that have been sent to us from before.
Sure.
We'll get to those. And you know, I'm always a bit sceptical and fearful of going out to the internet and asking them what they think of us. I know people like you, but sometimes people say some bad things about me. ASD, there's significant money, not significant in defence terms, but significant money sort of redirected into ASD to build the cyber capacity. It's a 10-year program.
Yep.
Is that just indicative of how hard it is to grow these capabilities?
In part, it's also about phasing it sensibly, because you've got to be able to digest you've got to build a workforce, you've got to build the operating systems. It's not just a question of buying the computers. But the CESAR initiative, and it goes back to the discussion we had earlier, we should see 2020 as additive to 2016. And I'm not going to say this in a critical way, but not so much the whole in 2016, but the unfinished business 2016.
It sounds like a criticism of me, Mike. It sounds almost like a criticism of me. You might clarify that?
No, happy to clarify. In fact, I'm happy to say it's a point that I made in 2016 because I was on the Secretary's Committee. But anyway, we 2020 consummated the journey. The cyber enhanced situational awareness and response capability, or CESAR, yes, a 10-year program. Ms Noble and her colleagues, I know, want to front-end load that as much as they can, but equally you've got to balance that off against the physical infrastructure you need, the IT infrastructure, the systems, the operating model. But we also have to land some of these other issues around how do you actively defend in a context where the law is still underdone, which is where the other element, the systems of national significance, come in. Which will entail on the government's current proposal the active defence of national infrastructure. Currently not able to be done lawfully by ASD. So we need to work through some legislative elements, workforce issues, physical facilities, IT facilities. That said, I know that the Director General and her staff, working with Home Affairs, want to crack on and get this capability in place as best as we can do with the money that's being given to ASD, and the threat picture that we'll get from that, the signatures that we'll be able to not only detect but also then transmit. The ASD are working through the process whereby in some cases some of those threat signatures will be given to the private sector at very highly classified levels, including what the remedies might be. And in other cases they're working through how they redact the sensitive collection elements and how they get that threat picture out. Our cybersecurity landscape, back to what we said earlier, in 4, 5, 6 years' time as a result of the two strategies taken together, I keep saying it's a couplet, plus the CESA initiative, will be so transformative that in 4 or 5 years' time, if you and I are sitting here in 4 or 5 years' time, by which time you would have done your research into World Series cricket of the late 70s. Shame on you, Alastair, for not being up to speed.
You also like the St George Dragons. We'll get to that. Listening to the Lowy Institute
we'll
podcast
get to that.
on you.
We'll be looking back in 4 to 5 years' time saying it's transformed. The whole landscape's transformed. There's a deeper industry. We have more weapons and tools to both protect critical sectors. We're on the front foot in terms of actively defending some of those sectors. We've got, to go back to a thread earlier that we didn't quite land, we've got an innovative sector here that is a continental version of Israel or Singapore. And you're right, you put your finger on it. Israel's has got a wonderful capability in this area, born of necessity.
Yeah, and it's not a necessity we want.
Not necessarily, but
as we don't want the threats.
Well, no, we certainly don't want the threats, but the existential threats that we face, whilst they're not as near term or as immediate as the threats faced by the State of Israel for a whole range of very different historical and strategic reasons, are not many leagues short of that. The geostrategic circumstances that we face, the geopolitical circumstances that we face, and as I said in my Edith Cowan speech a year and a half or so ago, at the end of 2018, the very notion of state sovereignty has been completely deconstructed. So the model that we've had for 4 centuries, whereby a state was coterminous with its territorial boundary, you had borders, you had territory, and yes, you might have saboteurs or you might have people trying to infiltrate the state, but essentially there was the outside world, and if someone tried to attack your state or try to come into your state, you had military forces to repel the attack, as occurred in Australia in the mid-20th century with a war against a potential invader. And typically, domestic security, law enforcement, and the regulation of your domestic affairs were hermetically sealed from the rest of the world. Cyber completely deconstructs all of that. There are people right now, whether they're in criminal cartels, in franchise criminal groups, or indeed, regrettably, in some state-sponsored areas, actively thinking about how do we attack Australia's sovereignty and infiltrate Australia through cyber. So we have to think, it's not quite as immediate as the existential threats that the State of Israel faces, but we have to completely rethink our approach to state security and sovereignty, because that notion of there being a physical barrier between us and the rest of the world, well, as you well know, cyber completely deconstructs that.
I often say that when I joined the police in 1989, and if there was a crime committed, there was an offender and a victim, and the evidence of them coming together somewhere in between the two.
Yes.
And that's just gone when it comes to cyber, certainly cyber crime, and same from a spying and other point of view, right?
So the ability, and we don't have time to go too deeply into the dark web, just simply for time, but just the activities that you see on the dark web, we have franchised criminals operating with what they assume to be, sometimes to their cost, by the way, with impunity.
Well, if you call yourself anonymous, you aren't necessarily anonymous.
Thank you. Yep. And there are some laws that we need to look at that give us some more tools in that regard. And the government's announced an intention to help to de-anonymise some of these vile criminals, some of whom engage in some of the most abhorrent practices you could imagine, particularly in relation to children. But the trading of the human trafficking, the trading of people, weapons, the dark websites that promote murder and violence as a service. It's completely abhorrent. And the thought that you say, well, there's a victim, a known victim, but we don't know where the perpetrator is. In fact, we don't know who the perpetrator is, and there's potentially a chance of never being able to work out who they are, simply because they are veiled by anonymisation through the dark web, just insults the very notion of sovereignty, because even...
Well, of civilization
Well,
too,
of civilization.
Right? I mean, by its nature.
Of its nature, because at least in the days of physical crime, you could say, okay, well, we've, through some stealth, some sleuthing, we've worked out that this syndicate is in this country, and through collaboration between police forces and mutual cooperation, we can't go there, but they can deal with them. The dark web creates an unseen or virtual realm that is outside of territory.
Yep.
Well, that cannot be allowed to stand. So we have to figure out, how do you pin the dark web to territory? And in addition to the very significant legislative proposals that are coming forward that I spoke about earlier on critical infrastructure and national systems of significance, probably just as importantly from a moral and policy point of view, will be the legislation that Mr Dutton will bring forward in terms of giving the police, the Australian Federal Police specifically, and the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission, the powers to attack the dark web with effectively the sorts of intelligence collection tools that I referred to earlier that are in the super test level of cricket activity.
So that's essentially giving the police the access to or assistance from an ASD to carry out
the government's announced an intention not, and I must say I strongly supported this, we gave advice, not to extend ASD's domestic collection powers for this purpose, but to recognising their deep technical competency, and Ministers Dutton and Reynolds have announced this, is to enable them in the lawful support, to provide lawful support to the AFP and the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission in the lawful pursuit of dark web intelligence collection. Were laws to be introduced to that effect, that would enliven ASD's technical assistance capability. Right. It would not enliven, I have to be clear, an ability on the part of the ASD itself to do the collection.
Right. Yeah, which is a really important distinction.
Yes.
Because there's two bits of commentary that I thought I might very briefly, and I've got through one page of 10 lots of questions, so we'll make this a weekly catch up, and we'll if you've probably got plenty of time in your diary, but one of the...
We haven't even started talking about the Dragons and
thank goodness.
League. I've been in mourning since the appointment of the head
COVID.
coach. Well, I didn't even call. I didn't indicate through
that you're available.
I said through the podcast with Michael Fullylove at Lowy that I put it out there. I'm blaming my media advisor for not ensuring that this offer was made to the board.
You might be able to use the van that you were threatening me with earlier on them. Then,
but anyway,
it's hard to get good staff.
It doesn't sound like we're going to get to rugby league. But anyway,
yes. So now we're down to one question, which was a nice little burn up of time there, Secretary. I like it. It's like you're in front of an estimates committee. One question that did come up consistently is, why rush the consultative process with the critical infrastructure stuff? It's so vital. We all know it is, and the passion of that, of how vital it is, clearly comes out. What's the rush?
Well, if given what you just said, Senator, the need to balance the imperative with consultation is well understood by the government. Andy Penn, you mentioned earlier, and you've had Andy appear in this series, led the consultative process, albeit at a more conceptual level. Yep. I fully accept that. The advisory process actually looked at this question in quite some detail. We received quite a number of submissions. We actively went out to the various sectors, AEMO to take one example in relation to electricity. Now, none of that is to say that was consulting on specific legislation. I'm not seeking to create that impression with this answer. But there is the questioner says rushed. There is an expedited, certainly, I wouldn't say compressed, but there's certainly an urgent consultation going on at the moment in relation to how to get the broad scheme right, remembering that the scheme will empower the Minister of the Day to designate certain obligations that would fall to sectors, which would then be delivered through either regulation or instruments. So
that'd be a slower time part.
Oh, absolutely, because the primary legislation, and this is where Mr. Dutton made it clear in the public comments that he made on this, and well, I'm making it clear here as well. The primary legislation will set out the scheme,
the SOCI Act,
what's in and out.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
So what's in and out? What's nationally significant infrastructure? What attracts a positive security obligation, which is the scheme in question. That'll evolve over time. There'll be submissions that the department would put up, the Critical Infrastructure Centre, which increasingly will become, we won't change the acronym, but it'll be the Critical Infrastructure and Cyber Security Centre for regulatory purposes, not operational purposes. They'll put up submissions and they'll say, look, for the next 3 or 4 years, for whatever geostrategic or other reason, Minister, you might wish to consider designating this sector or this element of a sector as critical infrastructure.
And just by way of really quick example, so you might separate out the SWIFT system in banking and have that higher up as a system of national significance than, say, banks themselves.
Yes. So without presuming that.
But
that's a great example.
Right.
So the scheme is subject, of course, to the Parliament seeing fit to consider it positively. The scheme will set up an enduring, decades-long framework that will, a bit like the foreign investment legislation that went through 40 years ago. You're constantly looking to refine the scheme.
And you swap it in and out.
But cases come through, all the time.
Fantastic. Well, look, I've, as I say, I'm through actually the first 2 dot points on a 10-page thing. It shows you that I over-prepared for the first time ever. I just want you to know, as you'd note from some of our past meetings. So I just want to say thank you. I've found it truly fascinating. I could literally meet with you every week if you'd take my calls. And
very happy to come back on the program.
That's very sweet of you. So thank you very much. I'll just say that we'll be back, if I haven't been sacked by the end of this, in a week or so's time to talk more about cybersecurity and cybersecurity strategy. But Mike Pezzullo, thanks very much for your time today.
Alastair, thank you very much. Thank you.